Here at the end of Black History Month, I'd like to share some of the wisdom from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His words have often stopped me in my tracks, making me both think and act. And recently, I wondered where many of those words came from. One place is one of his most famous books, Strength to Love. The cover of the book summarizes the contents well, saying, "Many of Martin Luther King's deepest insights about life, good and evil, and the Christian faith were forged in the heat of conflict and struggle." In this famous text, Dr. King brought together many of his most stirring pieces to address the perennial and perplexing questions of faith and social justice, such as how can we confront the complexity of our own natures to meet the challenges of justice and peace? And what can Jesus teach us about adversity, love, and freedom? These and many other challenging insights are found within the covers of this seminal book. I'll attempt to share just a few. And the first I'll share is something King says we each need to possess: a tough mind and a tender heart. This insight refers to a challenge I often have, and that is wanting simple solutions to complex problems. And simple solutions are almost always impossible. Here, King seems to be talking directly to many of us and to our problems today. Problems revolving around truth, lies, and even fake news. King says, "Life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony." The philosopher Hegel said that truth is found neither in the thesis nor the antithesis, but in an emergent synthesis that reconciles the two. Jesus recognized the need for blending opposites. He said, "Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." And we must combine the toughness of the serpent and the softness of the dove, a tough mind and a tender heart. King goes on to say, there is almost a universal quest for easy answers and half-baked solutions. Nothing pains people more than having to think. Unfortunately, our minds are constantly being invaded by legions of half-truths, prejudices, and false facts. One of the great needs of mankind is to be lifted above the morass of false propaganda. The soft-minded man always fears change. He feels security in the status quo, and he has almost a morbid fear of the new. For example, an elderly segregationist in the South is reported to have said, I have come to see now that desegregation is inevitable, but I pray to God that it will not take place until after I die." The soft-minded person always wants to freeze the moment and hold life in the gripping yoke of sameness. Soft-mindedness often invades religion. This is why religion has sometimes rejected new truth with a dogmatic passion. This has also led to a widespread belief that there is a conflict between science and religion, but this is not true. There may be a conflict between soft-minded religionists and tough-minded scientists, but not between science and religion. Science investigates, religion interprets. Science gives man knowledge that is power. Religion gives man wisdom that is control. Science deals mainly with facts. Religion deals mainly with values. The two are not rivals, they are complementary. Soft-mindedness affects us in other ways as well. Adolf Hitler realized that soft-mindedness was so prevalent among his followers that he said, "I use emotion for the many and reserve reason for the few." In Mein Kampf, he asserted, by means of shrewd lies repeated continuously, it is possible to make people believe that heaven is hell and hell is heaven. The greater the lie, the more readily will it be believed. There is little hope for us until we become tough-minded enough to break loose from the shackles of prejudice, half-truths, and downright ignorance. The shape of the world today does not permit us the luxury of soft-mindedness. A nation or civilization that continues to produce soft-minded men purchases its own spiritual death on an installment plan. These words of King were published almost 60 years ago, and they are just as relevant today as when he first wrote them. Even so, King goes on to caution us and says we can't stop with a tough mind. We must also have a tender heart. Tough-mindedness without tender-heartedness is cold and detached. What is more tragic than to see a person who has risen to the disciplined heights of tough-mindedness, but has at the same time sunk to the passionless depths of hard-heartedness? The hard-hearted person never truly loves. He engages in a crass utilitarianism that values other people mainly according to their usefulness to him. The hard-hearted person lacks the capacity for genuine compassion. He is unmoved by the pains and afflictions of his brothers. He passes unfortunate men every day, but he never really sees them. The hard-hearted individual never sees people as people, but rather as mere objects or as impersonable cogs in an ever-turning wheel. In the vast wheel of industry, he sees men only as hands to do work. Jesus reminds us that the good life combines the toughness of the serpent and the tenderness of the dove. To have serpent-like qualities devoid of dove-like qualities is to be passionless, mean, and selfish. To have dove-like qualities without serpent-like qualities is to be sentimental, anemic, and aimless. We must somehow combine them both. This challenge to combine these two opposite qualities is not easy, but that is the challenge that King assigns to each of us, being tough-minded and tender-hearted in a world that would have us be one or the other. The next insight I'll share is that we must be willing to take risks. King takes this on through the concept of altruism, which the dictionary defines as regard for and devotion to the interest of others. He pursues altruism through one of Jesus's most famous parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now remember, this is the parable of the man beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. Two highly respectable Jewish people, a Levite and a priest, passed by the man without helping, while a Samaritan, someone despised by Jews, helped the man. We don't relate to the ancient animosity between Jews and Samaritans, but we do when we substitute them for Christians and Muslims or other groups of people who vilify each other. Altruism comes into place when we move outside of our comfort zones and help someone alien to us, outside of our tribe or our economic group. Personally, after seeing someone in need, I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone else say, they don't deserve help, or be careful, you might get hurt, or it's just a waste of time. This other person in need is almost always someone who doesn't look like us, or who is obviously unstable, or from a vastly different economic situation. Whatever the case, we often find a reason to avoid them. But King says, one of the great tragedies of man's long trek along the history of highway has been the limiting of neighborly concern to tribe, race, class, or nation. The God of early Old Testament days was a tribal God, and the ethic was tribal. What are the devastating consequences of this narrow group-centered attitude? It means that one does not really mind what happens to the people outside of his or her group. If a white man is concerned only about his race, he will casually pass by the African American who has been robbed of his personhood, stripped of his sense of dignity, and left dying on some wayside road. The real tragedy of such narrow provincialism is that we see people as entities or merely as things. Too seldom do we see people in their true humanness. But for King, the Samaritan also possessed the capacity for what he calls a dangerous altruism. The Samaritan possibly risked his life to save someone else. And here King shares a personal story which brings the parable even more to life for us all. King says, when Mrs. King and I visited the Holy Land, we rented a car and drove from Jerusalem to Jericho. As we traveled slowly down the meandering road, a mountainous road, I said to my wife, I can now understand why Jesus chose this road as the setting for his parable. Jerusalem is some 2,000 feet above sea level, and Jericho 1,000 feet below sea level. The descent is made in less than 20 miles. Many sudden curves provide likely places for ambushing and expose the traveler to unforeseen attacks. Long ago, the road was known as the Bloody Pass. So it is possible that the priest and the Levite were afraid that if they stopped, they too would be beaten. Perhaps the robbers were still nearby, or perhaps the wounded man on the ground was a faker who wished to draw passing travelers to his side for quick and easy seizure. I imagine that the first question the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But by the very nature of his concern, the Good Samaritan reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? The Good Samaritan engaged in a dangerous altruism. Thus, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. Clearly, King clearly challenged us to confront violence with both compassion and courage, and yes, a tender heart. The next insight I'll share is a principle common to many religions, which is love your enemy. King says, upheaval after upheaval has reminded us that modern man is traveling along a road called hate, in a journey that will bring us to destruction and damnation. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, the command to love one's enemy is an absolute necessity for our survival. Love, even for enemies, is the key to the solution of the problems of our world. Jesus is not an impractical idealist. He is a practical realist. But first, we must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. Forgiveness does not mean ignoring what has been done or putting a false label on an evil act. It means that the evil act no longer remains as a barrier to the relationship. Forgiveness is a catalyst, creating the atmosphere necessary for a fresh start and a new beginning. Forgiveness means reconciliation, a coming together again. Without this, no man can love his enemies. The degree to which we are able to forgive determines the degree to which we are able to love our enemies. Second, we must recognize that the evil deed of an enemy or even a neighbor, the thing that hurts, never quite expresses all that he is. This simply means that there is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. And finally, we must not seek to defeat or humiliate the enemy, but to win his friendship and understanding. Yes, this is often difficult and sometimes seemingly impossible. Even so, loving our enemies is difficult, but we should be glad Jesus didn't say, like your enemies. It's almost impossible to like some people. Like is a sentimental and affectionate word. How can we like a person who is threatening our children and bombing our homes? That is impossible. But Jesus recognized that love is greater than like. When Jesus bids us to love our enemies, he is speaking neither of romantic love or of a friendship kind of love. He is speaking of agape, an overflowing love that seeks nothing in return, a love for each person and all of humanity. In our own UU terminology, it's both the inherent worth and dignity of every person and a respect for all the existence of which we are a part. King then shares one of his most powerful insights. Why should we love our enemies? Because returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate. Violence multiplies violence. And toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. So when Jesus says, love your enemies, he is setting forth a profound and ultimately inescapable admonition. The chain reaction of evil, hate begetting hate, wars producing more wars, must be broken, or we shall be plunged into the dark abyss of annihilation. Clearly, King expects us to have a tough mind attempting to understand all of the complex reasons which lead us to being enemies with others. But at the same time, he expects us to have a tender heart and to love our enemies, because hate does not heal, only love does that. In summary, King has challenged us to take risks for others outside our individual tribes, and he's explained why we need to forgive our enemies. These are tough challenges for us all, but he reminds us who we are in his final call to action. King says, we must be willing to reform. He was speaking to the church of 1963, but it resonates just as well today. King said, by ignoring the need for social reform, religion is divorced from the mainstream of human life. I am certain we need to pray for God's help and guidance in all our struggles, but we are gravely misled if we think the struggle will be won only by prayer. God, who gave us minds for thinking and bodies for working, would defeat his own purpose if he permitted us to obtain through prayer what may come through work and intelligence. Prayer is a marvelous and necessary supplement to our feeble efforts, but it is a dangerous substitute. When Moses strove to lead the Israelites to the promised land, God made it clear that he would not do for them what they could do for themselves. We must pray earnestly for peace, but we must also work vigorously for disarmament and the suspension of weapons testing. We must pray with unceasing passion for racial justice, but we must also use our minds to develop programs, organize ourselves into mass nonviolent action, and employ every resource of our bodies and souls to bring an end to racial injustice. We must pray unrelentingly for economic justice, but we must also work diligently to bring into being those social changes that make for a better distribution of wealth within our nation and in the undeveloped countries of the world. We must learn that to expect God to do everything while we do nothing is not faith, but superstition. Always, man must do something. Man is no helpless invalid left in a valley of total depravity until God pulls him out. Man is rather an upstanding human being whose vision has been impaired by the cataracts of greed and power, and whose soul has been weakened by the virus of pride. And yet, when we strive to possess a tough mind and a tender heart, our lives can become a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony, resulting in a better life for all. That is no easy task, but living in this very complex and difficult world we find ourselves in requires that we give it a shot and do our best. I'll close by sharing again what I consider to be King's most profound proclamation. Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Finding the strength to love each and every one will never be easy, but it is something we absolutely must do. Amen and namaste.